My memory of him is someone who everybody liked, and he didn't seem to have many worries, you know. And he played in the band and was president of the student body in high school, and a class favorite, and all those kind of things. And he just seemed to enjoy himself. If Steve discovered that there was something more, he gravitated to it. And he lived in New York, he lived in Dallas, he spent the last decade or so, maybe more than that, in LA. And he loved the urban lifestyle. And he was a writer and a journalist, and those are the kind of things that he wrote about. And at some point, I really don't know when, he began to grapple with the realization that he was gay. And here we are in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was a difficult issue for him and for a lot of people, particularly from small town Texas. He called to tell me that his partner Jaime was in the hospital and was seriously ill. I think we understood that it was connected to this mysterious scourge, and I knew enough to ask Steve whether he was affected. And he said, my immune system has been compromised. And that was sort of a euphemistic way of saying, I too am HIV positive. I remember being out there or being with him when he went to the doctor. I took him to the doctor. He'd been treating Steve for a while, and he said, Steve, there's nothing else I can do. And I remember sitting there thinking, he just delivered my brother's death sentence. How do you respond to that?
Were you mad, or were you quiet?
No, I was bewildered and frustrated because I didn't know what else. I didn't know what my brother needed, and I didn't know what I could provide for him. And so we walked out and we went to Spike Lee's hamburger place and sat there and shared a couple of burgers and a Coke. But he kept resisting moving back to Texas because that would be the final surrender, I guess, in his mind. It wasn't hard to see that things were really, really serious. And, you know, for those of us who had known him also, to see this strong, healthy young man just almost before your eyes deteriorate. And while he was with us, he began to lose his eyesight, even though his eyes were fine, but the connection with the brain was blocked somehow. He could barely talk. He couldn't remember things. Sometimes wouldn't know who we were. I remember he also developed the Kaposi sarcoma, and he was constantly losing weight. And then when it reached the brain, just everything began to go wrong. Couldn't swallow. He didn't know how to swallow. And earlier, probably a year or two earlier, he had gone back to his high school reunion. He went into the building where the gathering was, and people started coming out and crying because they couldn't bear to see the Steve they knew, who had become the skeletal Steve because of the illness. But, you know, friends would call. He usually couldn't talk to them, but they would call. it got to be bedtime, and Steve, I remember telling Steve, it's time to go to bed. And he said, no, I can't, I have to go home. And I remember saying, I mean, you are home. It was like 10 at night or something. And he said, okay. And then he walked over to our dad and held out his hand and said goodbye to him. So Steve went in his room.
What did Pop say?
He said, I think he said something like, I'll see you in the morning. And Steve went in his room, and the rest of us got ready to go to bed, you and Pete and Tara and me. And our mother, Mama Mill to you, said, maybe I should sleep down here on the couch. Because the couch, the living room is close to Steve's room.
Yeah, I remember that.
And to my great regret, I said, no, you don't need to do that. Just go into your room. I'll check on it. And she had gone in to check on him in the middle of the night, and he wasn't there. And here we are in December, and it's cold. And we looked around the house, we looked in the attic, we called the police, they asked that they looked around the house, and we couldn't find him. It's like he'd been transported, and it began to a misty rain began to fall. We couldn't find him that night, couldn't find him the next day, the next day, the next day. You can imagine the panic and the anxiety. I worked for the governor, and she organized or got the National Guard to send a helicopter over the neighborhood. Couldn't find him. Some kind of search and rescue unit, an official kind of unit, came in, looked around the neighborhood, couldn't find him. Days become weeks. We had no idea where our brother, our son, had gone. These detectives who had been on the case the whole time, one of them called and said, we found your brother. And as it turned out, he had apparently wandered out of the house, turned the corner, and just kept on walking for about a mile, and then had laid down or fallen down or something in the yard of a big house. And the yard had sort of a ravine, and these workmen in the yard had come upon his remains, and it was about a block from Town Lake. It still doesn't make sense, except I wonder when he said, I'm going home, if he had some notion that he had to get somewhere, some final intuition that he had to go somewhere.
He couldn't stay
Yeah,
there.
yeah. And how he made it that far, I don't know. So it's an enduring mystery, and will be for the rest of our lives. I don't know what happened. They're all kind of images, memories that come to mind when I think about that period. I think, for example, of a conversation between my dad, who was in his late 80s, and his brother, who was not much younger. And his brother said something in kind of a thoughtless way. Well, when you live like that, you get what you deserve. And here's this old man looking at his brother saying, nobody deserved that. And I think that was symbolic of the nation, that it softened people. And here we are 20 years later, and finally gay marriage is becoming legal and accepted. And maybe that was the beginning of people coming to realize that these stone cold positions that their church had taught them, or that their intuition had led them to, didn't hold up, because these are human beings. I don't want to call it, well, it was a waste.
What do you mean?
In the sense that we lost so many people who were so talented. And I think about problems that our family and our extended families have had over the years, that had we had Steve's sort of lightness of being, he would remind us to lighten up and to care for each other and to enjoy ourselves. And we needed that.